So welcome again. Let's go ahead and get started. Happy New Year to everyone if I haven't talked to you personally yet. It's good to see. I'm seeing tons of familiar names and some faces for our first meetup of 2021. Welcome as well to our new guests. It's really good to have you with us. My name's Annabelle Munson. I'm your host and moderator today. So we're going to focus on clearly a catch up on what's been happening in the field regarding restrictions, hot topics and trends in global ops. And yes, specifically in that section, we're going to address North America and the current, the most immediate changes that just came out for the US. We are going to check back in on Brexit as well, now that January 1 has passed, and you're going to give you the latest on some UK specific ops news. I do have a special guest from our friends at G3 Global Visas as well to provide G3 Global Services, to provide some insights into visa and passport accessibility. Plus, we're going to check on some regulatory best practices. That's from our Global Regulatory Services team, things that I think you could find useful right now as you're getting back into operations. And of course, we're going to wrap up with your questions. So do get those questions in at any time in the chat. But again, I'm going to encourage you, if they're specific to the US COVID testing requirements, try to hold on to those for just a few minutes while we get through that introductory section. Like I mentioned, a lot to cover. So let's go ahead and get started. Who's with us today? Let me introduce them. Christine Van Backus, again, our Senior Account Manager, Charter Management, and our COVID Ops expert. Jason Hayward, General Manager with Universal Aviation UK. Laura Everington was supposed to be joining us from our Global Regulatory Services team, but sadly she had to step out at the last minute. She had a conflict. So we are, however, very lucky to have our Manager of Global Regulatory Services, Adam Hartley, with us. And finally, our guest from G3 Global Services, Philip Thompson, to talk about visas. Welcome to all of you. And as always, though, I'm going to start off with Christine. So Christine, welcome and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, everyone.
So what's the latest from the Caribbean, Christine?
So the Caribbean has remained relatively stable. What we've seen is certain countries are reissuing their night restrictions. So you're going to want to be careful of that when you go there. And obviously, a lot of these countries are also restricting flights coming from the UK.
Great. And Central America?
Central America, as with the Caribbean, has remained relatively stable, but countries like Panama are restricting any persons that have been to the UK or South Africa in the preceding 21 days.
Got it. Okay, moving to South America then.
Unlike the rest of their northern people, South America is restricting flights coming in. Colombia reintroduced the COVID restrictions. So you're going to need testing. And of course, Brazil, as with Colombia, has reintroduced the COVID testing along with an online health form. What's important to note for Brazil is that these restrictions do apply to crew. They're not exempt. And then we have countries like Chile. When you do enter now, they require a 10-day mandatory quarantine. You also may be tested on arrival. And of course, they are also restricting persons that have been in the British territory within the preceding 14 days. And last but not least, Bolivia is banning all flights from the EU through February 8th.
Got it. Okay. Well, since you mentioned Europe, let's go ahead and go there next. What's the latest?
So I'll leave the UK stuff to Jason. As far as Ireland is concerned, they just issued a notice today that effective January 16th, they will require everyone coming into Ireland to have a COVID test prior to arrival. It needs to be done 72 hours prior to travel. Crew are exempt, and by that I mean active crew. As far as the rest of Europe, there have been tightening restrictions. There's a lot of night curfews and lockdowns to consider. Essential business travel is still possible, but you need to keep those in mind. Also, intra-country travel. A good example of this is Italy. They are restricting any intra-country travel that's not considered essential. But it's important to note that there still are options. So recently we determined that as far as Germany, though coming from the US requires permission from the police for essential business purposes, if you do make a stop overnight in Ireland, and then from there proceed to Germany, it's considered a domestic stop. What's important to note for here is that it needs to be an overnight, and the passports for the passengers are stamped by Irish Customs. So then you forego the requirement that's needed from coming from the US.
Got it. Okay, then let's go ahead and move to Africa.
Africa has remained relatively stable. Just like the rest of the world, they are imposing restrictions for flights coming from the UK and South Africa. South Africa has now implemented additional restrictions in addition to the requirements for coming in. One of the three main airports, the COVID testing, the getting checked on arrival, they're now also requiring that you get checked on departure. So you will be tested. If you do test positive, then you're required to remain in the country and quarantine for 10 days. And then we have the Middle East. Obviously, Saudi Arabia has opened their borders to all flights now, except for tourism. And Lebanon is restricting the number of entrants coming into the country. They are requiring COVID test prior to arrival, 96 hours. You will be tested on arrival again, and then you will have to be in quarantine for a week before you can move about.
Okay, and let's go ahead and wrap up your segment, Christine, before we get to Jason in the UK update. Let's finish with Asia Pacific.
So this region continues on its trajectory as far as remaining relatively closed since this first started. The one note that did come through recently is that Singapore Civil Aviation created or issued a notice advising that if you are a foreign crew, non-Singaporean, and you're looking to overnight somewhere for crew rest, if you can prove that you have crew duty limitations and you can get an approval from Civil Aviation Singapore, they will permit you to do so. Also, the Philippines is restricting entry from all US nationals into the country through January 15th. So we're going to have to monitor closely when that does open up again.
Great. Okay, thank you, Christine. And I was wrong. We're going to go to Adam next with our North America update, but we'll leave Jason off the hook for just one more minute. There he is. Okay, awesome. So Adam, you're on for our North America update. So good to have you with us. Welcome and Happy New Year. I know you have some very, very important and late-breaking updates to share regarding COVID testing requirements in particular.
Yeah, so let's talk about that first. And I think, that's where anything really needs to start. If we're going to talk about North America, and some of the stuff Christine just talked about around the world is about access. Obviously, with this new requirement, North America being US, Canada, and Mexico, we've already seen this roll out in Canada as a testing requirements. Now we're seeing it roll out in the United States for testing requirements. But this is really all about access. So these are minimum requirements for travelers to enter the United States. So the layers that come with access are the testing requirement now, and then the presidential proclamations that are unaffected by new testing requirements and still suspend a lot of travelers to the United States.
Great. So for Adam, we've had a couple of very specific questions. Do you want to go into those now?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about so some of the stuff that we highlighted first. Let me take a stab at testing really quick, Annabelle, and then we'll play some questions from there. So the first thing we're talking about is scope, and so what comes back to mind there is who is captured by this, and of course the order applies to all flights, including private flights and general aviation aircraft, in parentheses charter. So it shows us here the CDC was very careful. After their initial UK airline or flight from the UK airline ban, to be very specific that they did in fact mean all passengers on all flights, and then went into detail on those specific types to describe business aviation, non-scheduled charter, our industry as a whole. There is exemptions in there about active crew that I think is very important. There's also a little bit of question I have for the CDC in how they describe deadhead crew. So again, the airline terminology kind of folds its way into the order there. So we want to really be very clear about how they define active crew and deadhead crew who may be in transit to an active flight or in transit from an active flight. So I think those are important things we want to clarify. It is the requirement of the operator. So just like it's the requirement of the airline, it's the requirement of the operator to receive proof of the negative result and attestation prior to boarding the aircraft. And it's the operator in private flight and general aviation operators' requirement to maintain the records of that attestation for 2 years. The order does take effect on January the 26th. One of the hot topic questions that came in was about applicability as far as scope. So what region does this control? So this is applicable to passengers arriving from any foreign country. A foreign country is defined as anywhere that's not a state, territory, or possession of the United States. So a good example, or one we've seen a lot today, is somebody says, I'm operating from the continental U.S. Virgin Islands to the U.S. Virgin Islands and back. Is that required? And in this case, no, a test would not be required from the U.S. to the Virgin Islands and back, because there is no foreign country in that itinerary. And the last, and then I'll open it back up to you for questions, but last was we did confirm already with Eric Rodriguez from CBP, the program manager for GA, that CBP continues to play no role in implementation, monitoring, or enforcement of the latest CDC restrictions. So what I mean by that is that a negative test result is not going to be required in submission of landing rights to U.S. Customs and should not be something that U.S. Customs is talking about on arrival into the States. So with that, I'll leave it open to questions.
Got it. All right. So something that in particular we got this morning was the vaccine question. So some people are already receiving vaccines, and the question is that going to be used as proof instead of, can it replace a test? So if you have proof of full vaccination, does that clear you?
So no, right now there's no allowance for that in this current reg. Is that something that we should absolutely push back to CDC and clarify? I think so, but that's not allowed for in this first regulation that's or this new order that's been put out. That's not addressed as a substitute.
Got it. And then I know that there is obviously there's a lot of documentation that has that is available already. Lewis, I think, is able to put up a couple of those links in our chat area, so we can go ahead put that up, Lewis, if you are ready or here in the moment. So I know we've been receiving questions already. I think that based on the volume of questions that we are getting, we may need to organize those a bit. Lewis, I know you're in the background at the moment. Go ahead and it's coming in fast and furious. So I suggest we organize those towards the end, unless there's anything else, Christine, in particular, since you've been listening to the overview, you think we need to address right now to make sure we've set the stage?
Oh, I think we're good.
Great. Okay, awesome. So Adam, we're going to let you catch your breath. Thank you for the quick update. I know we're going to be coming back to you, so have that water ready. We may need you. Great. All right. Oh, actually, as I say that, I realize I did have a couple of, since that just took over all of my brain power when it came to the breaking news. I did have a couple other quick questions for you regarding North America. When we talked yesterday, you had mentioned you wanted to make sure to address some best practices for U.S. access. I mean, obviously now we've got the testing, but is there anything else you want to mention in terms of outside of the new mandate?
Yeah, so the other piece that still governs access to the United States is obviously the presidential proclamations. So national interest waivers and exploring those for any specific opportunities or flights that may be exempt from those proclamations, and then also a visa waiver program. So if you're not a part of the visa waiver program, as you see these changing requirements, it's a fantastic boost to your operational flexibility for flights that come to operate internationally into the United States. So a best practice that we'll keep talking about it every chance we get.
Great. Okay, so definitely keep those in mind. And not to leave it out, but since we're covering North America, any additional information on Canada?
Well, the requirements very similar testing, right, Christine? So PCR testing, proof of a negative result but I think CBSA is playing a much more active role than CBP is. So all of that's data and information needs to be provided to CBSA, Canadian Customs, for their landing rights approval prior to access to the country. But highly restricted, foreign nationals operating to Canada are highly restricted, and the ones who are able to operate do now require a PCR equivalent test.
Got it. Okay. Good deal. So Adam, thank you again. Like I said, rest up for now because I know for sure going to be getting back to you. I'm going to go ahead and transition over to Jason. So let's go back to Europe and talk about a little bit what's been going on since Brexit was completed January 1st. So hello, Jason. Welcome. All right. So let's jump in. What additional can you confirm about Brexit's impact?
Well, the good news is the sky didn't fall in on the 1st of January, as some people had anticipated. The UK and the EU were able to reach an agreement on the 30th, so with just a day to spare. And that is an all-encompassing free trade agreement between the EU and the UK. The document runs to more than 2,000 pages, but there's still not much in the way of clarity on the subject of aircraft importations that were done in the UK for free circulation in Europe, or the effects of aircraft parts. So we're still seeking clarity from the UK Treasury as to the status of those important topics. Immigration, though, actually remains pretty much unaffected. However, EU nationals who are living in the UK will need to make sure that they have the correct documents for their residency and for working, and the same for UK nationals who are living and working in mainland Europe. Pets, UK GB passports for pets are being phased out, and they will be really only effective now until the summer. So we would advise anybody who's using a UK passport to travel to Europe should either go and get a health certificate prior to travel, or actually apply for an EU pet passport. The biggest source of contention will remain traffic rights, because as I mentioned in the last piece that we did in December, the EU actually doesn't control the traffic rights in all EU countries. So now the EU and the UK are left with a situation that the UK has now got to get 27 new traffic right agreements with each separate EU country, and each EU country is going about that in very different ways. Some countries are asking UK operators to lay down a $4,000 deposit. They're asking for all sorts of paperwork, security plans, and that's going to be quite a painful process. Nobody is granting UK charter operators fifth freedom flights either, so only third and fourth freedoms are being allowed at the moment. The UK, on the other hand, has allowed EU operators a 3-month blanket permit to continue to operate in the UK, but they will rescind that should individual countries not show the same level of reciprocation. So still lots of things to be worked out, and it'll be a continuing story that evolves over the next few months, I guess.
Well, I guess that means we're just going to have you back a few times then, Jason, as that evolves. So I guess the other thing that is on everyone's mind is the UK lockdowns. What's the impact for operators?
Actually, so there's two important events here on the 15th of this month. The first is as of 4 a.m., all passengers arriving into the UK will need to have provided a negative COVID test. Now that could be the PCR test, the LAMP or lateral flow test, as well as having completed their passenger locator form on arrival. When they arrive in the UK, they will still need to self-isolate for 10 days. However, at the 5-day mark, they can choose to take a private COVID test, and if that's negative, then they can end their self-isolation on day 5. All flights from South Africa are banned as well. The British government's very busy rolling out the vaccine, and so far I think they've vaccinated something like 2.6 million most vulnerable British nationals, and we're kind of hopeful that come late March towards Easter, they'll be in a position to start lifting some of these travel restrictions.
Got it. Well, we will be hopeful on all fronts. So thank you, Jason, for the update. I do want to turn now to our guest with G3 Global Services, to Philip. Welcome. So you are our guest because we got so many questions back in November and December, real specific to visas and visa accessibility and what's changed. So I definitely want to get your insight on that. I just did want to give a heads up to all of our attendees. Obviously, as I mentioned at the top, we're going to be running over. We are about another 10 minutes till our normal closing time, but we're going to expect to at least be about 15 minutes over. So just your heads up, we will be recording, but hope you can stay with us. So I'm going to go ahead and pass over to Philip. And Philip, would you mind sharing with us briefly some of the challenges visa, passport, and documentation processing have encountered since COVID started?
Sure. And good afternoon, Annabelle and the Universal team and everyone joining the webinar. It's a pleasure to join today. So honestly, we've all seen a latitude of challenges across the board through the travel documentation procurement process. Today, I want to specifically talk about a few areas that have been potential high points or low points for us in the travel industry. One being the additional COVID health screening for travel and an additional health addendums used and needed for visa application processing. We have seen the majority of countries add to their process that in addition to their standard requirements, that you now have to provide some form of negative PCR testing, both in some cases during the application process, as well as before or at the time of departure. So keep that in mind as you're planning these international trips, even with some of the flight crews and general aviation and business travelers, that you have to keep that in mind, that you may need those testings, negative PCR results before, during the visa application process and before departure. Additionally, I want to focus a little bit about the status of passport processing here in the United States. So we've all seen, I think, that over a 9 million passport request backlog earlier in 2020. Well, the U.S. Passport Agency has made tremendous strides to get that backlog completed. So now they're offering two services. One is a standard 10 to 12 week service for passport renewals and adjudicated services, so new adult passports and minor passports. Here recently, they opened up and are now offering an expedited process, which is 4 to 6 weeks. Now, I know a lot of you are saying that expedited process looks nothing like it did back in 2019, in the early part of 2020, when we could get an expedited passport within 24 to 48 hours. But we are seeing some really positive momentum and movement on the U.S. Passport Agency side, and passport agencies across the globe. We're starting to see that pick up and passports being issued at a faster rate. Third, just real super quick, for embassies and consulates here in the United States, as well as around the globe. So one of the primary challenges that we've documented and seen countless times over is limited staffing in the consulates and embassies, which creates delayed processing for visa requests and any additional travel document requests. So again, keep these things in mind as you're planning your trips over the next several months to a year, that one-time visa process that may have taken 3 to 5 business days is now taking upwards to 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes 4 weeks. So please keep that in mind as well. Lastly, I just want to end with, they have made, or the United States Passport Agency has made some additional strides as far as creating a process available for flight crew and folks on the GENDEC, General Declaration of Aviation. So they've created a active crew passport department where we can now secure passports for active duty crew members within 7 to 9 business days. That sounds a lot better than 4 to 6 weeks. So we are seeing where allowances are being made to forward the travel industry and at least get our people up in the skies and flying as soon as possible.
Indeed. And so I guess in closing, for day-to-day operations for our listeners, what would be your recommendations?
So, specifically, I think we need to focus on 2 things, and I'll wrap this into best practices as well. So understand that communication is obviously has always been at a heightened point, but specifically now, as these agencies are creating policies for travel, keep in mind and please be aware that a lot of times that policy communication doesn't trickle down to that immigrations officer or that visa officer immediately. So, at this time, we're starting to see, challenges not only from our perspective, but internal challenges that we're seeing that may delay the process. And then finally, and I'll always end with this, best practices across the board. I don't care who's traveling or how you're traveling. Make sure you have validity in your passport at minimum 6 months. Make sure you have up-to-date photos, digital photos that can either be printed out or emailed to an immigration officer. And then finally, we understand that it is going to be the new norm, COVID testing and negative PCR testing. So just keep in mind that G3 Global Services also offers these at-home test kits, non-invasive, FDA-approved kits where you can get a bundle of kits, sit them in your hangar, sit them in your office, and you'll have them available anytime a crew or business person wants to travel. That's all I have.
Got it. Okay. Well, thank you, Philip. A lot of
You're
good
very welcome.
information there. And I know that Lewis had received a URL from you that had some additional information available at your website. So, Lewis, if you get a chance, in between dodging all of those cute questions that are coming in, if you would not mind dropping that into the chat, that would be awesome. So if you need to get in touch with Philip, you can reach him as well as get more information. Thank you so much, Philip, for that insight. And then Adam, we were going to close up with you as terms of this section before we get to our Q&A. And specifically here we're talking about, so speaking of best practices, as Philip said on the visa side, we wanted to touch base with you on things to consider from everything you've been working on with our customers over the last couple of months. So from a regulatory perspective. So
yeah, I think the visa waiver or the visa issue that Philip just raised is interesting, in the passport issue. It shines that light again on the visa waiver program and the flexibility that program gives you. I want to highlight a couple of other things, and this is stuff we've been talking about on global regulatory services since really the start of COVID, and trying to help operators who either have had a break between flying internationally, or they've furloughed or had a change in personnel, and you have different regulatory programs that had people, different parties responsible for them in the past. So we're really trying to check in with our clients and do a GRS checkup, do a GRS profile review, and see where you stand with all those regulatory programs. Who's taking care of Senium? Do you have your UK PD, visa waiver, STEP enrollment? Are you giving your American travelers traveling abroad that extra resource in their back pocket? All of those things are great best practices for operators traveling internationally right now in these kind of uncertain times. So if anybody would like to reach out to us to discuss 10, 15 minutes, we'd love to do it.
got it. And I think Adam too, so when we talked yesterday, I think I gave Lewis already, we have a link on our website. So if you're at all interested in learning more about how you can do that gap analysis with the GRS team, or just find out more about what you may be missing, this is an easy way to do it. Lewis, great, I think he's got it. So if you click through there, there's just a checklist of things. And if you want to learn more about how that may apply to your operation, just send that form in. Adam and his team will receive it directly, and you can talk to the experts. Okay, great. Now I'm going to do a bit of a check-in here with my team because as we just noticed, the chat has been busy. So I normally at this point would, and I want to thank all of you that send in questions in advance. And I definitely want to be hugely respectful of that. But my question is to Lewis, since he's been keeping a pulse on everything that's coming in live, and since we have such an interest in the breaking news that clearly we didn't know about till just last night, do we want to defer some of the questions that were asked in advance that I already have documented with the team that we can go back to jump in to the COVID specific question, COVID testing specific questions? Or should I keep with our program, kind of ask a few of those pre-submitted questions first? Lewis, what's your take on that right now?
Annabelle, given the volume of questions we're getting about the new CDC guidance, I think that's where we should probably focus.
Okay, awesome. And so to all of you who sent in your questions in advance, I have them, and let's put it this way. I'll be very direct. If we cannot get to them in our time today, we'll make sure that you get an answer specifically from someone on our team. Is that fair? Okay, well, cool. Well, then, Lewis, I'm going to hand over to you since you've got your pulse, your finger on the pulse. Let me know where we need to go.
Thanks, Annabelle. But there was one question that we did get, and I think it's a quick answer. Christine, if you can handle this one before we jump back to CDC guidance, because we've received it several times. Could you give us the latest on the World Economic Forum in Singapore and the Olympics in Japan?
So the World Economic Forum is still planning on taking place in May. We just communicated with Civil Aviation Singapore. As of this moment, they have not provided any guidance. So we are really keeping a close eye on when that is going to be known, because I know it's going to be a big event out there. Also, it's important to note that as it pertains to the event, if parking is not available, the primary airport would be Whiskey Sierra Sierra Lima, as Changi is primarily for commercial airlines. we were going to have to look at what is going to be available closer to the date of ops as far as parking, because there are restrictions for U.S. nationals throughout that whole region. As far as the Olympics are concerned, there was recent news that the Olympic Committee is planning to have events. What is going on here is that the Olympic Committee is considering having the games take place this summer. As such, they're looking to maybe do some testing on this to see the applicability of it. If they do confirm it, they'll issue an official notice on this, and then they'll release the slot schedule program. So we're just going to have to wait and see. We've already been speaking to civil aviation out there. So once that guidance is known, or a status, then we'll brief everyone.
Thanks, Christine. So jumping back into the CDC testing requirements, Adam, a question we received quite a bit of was how it pertains to the vaccine. If you have a vaccine, are you exempt?
The simple answer now is no, that the current order does not provide for a vaccination or detail specific types of vaccinations that may or may not be used as a substitute. So that's probably something that's still going to be developing with CDC as the vaccination continues to roll out. But I think right now it's trying to get a handle on it and having a more restrictive approach that'll then evolve to a less restrictive approach.
Thanks. And you talked a little bit earlier about active crew, but we've gotten a lot of questions about what is considered an active crew, even to the level of, servers in flight. Can you talk a little bit about active crew? Like, is a cabin server or a mechanic considered active crew?
Yeah, and so we could go back to some definitions of active flight crew. I think we do want to validate this one with CDC and see exactly who they meant to pull in by this under this designation. I don't think they have a good site that goes back to defining a specific crew, but I'm looking for, like I said before, they describe crew through the lens of an airline, right? And so they're talking about deadhead crew, where those terminologies don't really apply to us as well. So I think we need further qualification on that and ask that question directly on which types of crew members apply as active crew.
Thanks. Putting on your forecasting hat, do you see this applying domestically as well?
I'm not a forecaster. I try to avoid the magic ball, and even with something like this, I wait until we see the actual regs and then work from there. I don't have a good sense on what may happen on the domestic side right now.
We've got a lot of questions and specific scenarios, but more generic. Any guidance on how to find PCR tests overseas to meet that 72-hour window?
I think I can help with that.
Yeah, Christine could probably help there.
As it pertains to the international side, we work with our vendors, either our universal offices worldwide or our ground handlers at each location. So we are currently compiling this to be able to provide that. So either it's something that you can book yourself via the airport, or it's going to be something that our offices will be able to assist with as far as booking those appointments. The important thing to note is that it is quite new, so we are seeking that information out. So for each trip, I would recommend that this is something that we go ahead and get that for each and every trip.
Thanks, Christine. Adam, back to you. Can you talk a little bit about how this will impact medical and air ambulance flights and transporting COVID patients?
Yeah, so we've been dealing with those types of flights throughout this process, throughout COVID this year. So I think that's still going to be a different, air ambulance. We're going to kind of declare those things to CBP and work through that process there. Whether I haven't seen a waiver yet from the CDC, and I know there's a lot of questions out there about waivers for specific instances, and I have not seen them issue anything like that yet. But we've been processing those types of flights, and I don't see why they would fundamentally change here, because that's kind of a different scenario than saying, hey, we've all tested negative so we can get on this flight and we're not a threat, we're not an unknown threat, versus, hey, I've got an air ambulance supporting a COVID patient, let's put all of our cards on the table, everybody knows what's going on here, and they're being cared for by medical professionals, and that's handled through a more of a normal official channel.
Thanks. And we've got some questions about enforcement. How is this going to be enforced?
Yeah, so that's the big one, right? Is enforcement. So we already talked very quickly at the very beginning that CBP is not going to play a role in enforcement. This should not come up in landing rights. This should not come up on customs clearance. But when we look at this attestation that they're asking for, and if you just work through the document real quick of some of the document or what they're asking your passengers to declare and provide to you, there's also a punishment section of that each passenger must provide an attestation, and that a failure to provide this attestation or submitting false or misleading information could result in poor effects on your travel, obviously delay, denial, those kind of things, or be subject to criminal penalties per these criminal codes. So the requirement on the airline or the aircraft operator, and it's in the FAQ, is to hold it for those attestations for 2 years, and your enforcement is really the fear of an audit, right? That CDC could come back and audit and ask for those records, and then levy criminal penalties against the operator, and the passenger or the traveler.
Thanks, Adam. We've received a couple questions from people that Ferry Aircraft. Any idea how it will impact ferry flights? Maybe an example is if you land in a country, spend one night, then leave the next morning. Any exemptions possible?
Say that again. So is that in terms of presidential proclamation, or is that in terms of
a
ferry flight? A ferry flight is active crew only. So a ferry flight would be exempt from, unless it's a special scenario. If it was just an active crew only on the aircraft, they would be exempt from this requirement. I think, there's a lot of these scenarios, Christine, that we were talking about before we got on here about if somebody has a short round robin trip and they're PCR testing in the US versus PCR testing in their origin before coming back to the US. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, how you see those scenarios. It's really more of how it's been playing out in a global sense than it has in the US so far.
Well, on a global sense, if you're just dropping and going, in many cases, crew are exempt from those requirements as far as testing is concerned. Right now, based on the guidance that I've seen from the CDC, it doesn't really give clarity. Active crew are good, but passengers may not be. So the important thing I think that we're going to have to try to see from guidance from the CDC is what those exemptions are. Because if you're leaving from the US, going to an XYZ location for business and coming back the same day, I see it feasible to do a test prior to your departure, have your test in hand, go and come, but we're going to really have to seek that clarification from CDC because it's not in its current, data that they issued.
Yeah, it's not. It's those scenarios that get down in the weeds a little bit, and because the CDC is not generally aircraft operators, and what they do know about aircraft operators is generally through the lens of airlines. Obviously, we were lucky enough to be addressed directly in this order, where we generally haven't been in the past with CDC, and we've had to kind of pry that information out of them. But there is still some gaps here that are pretty generic ways of how we operate in business aviation, but fall into a gray area within this order. So we want to hear those scenarios, and we want to try to get you answers. But we will have some challenges in addressing specific business aviation aircraft operation scenarios with points of contact at the CDC, because it's just a different business to them.
Adam, I know some states have put out approved list and countries approved list of facilities. Have we heard anything about an approved list of facilities for the test so far?
My understanding is that the guidance is not clear as far as approved locations outside of an NAAT type test, a nucleic acid amplification test, which the RT-PCR falls in the same category. It's just a different name for it. So I would recommend that you ensure that you utilize a facility that will provide you that RT-PCR test, which is what's commonly known.
Thanks, Christine. Question back to some crew question. If you stay out of the country for several days and you're waiting on passengers, are you considered on duty the entire time?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's if you're out with the aircraft waiting on the passengers, I would consider that if you're traveling with the aircraft and the crew is available to that aircraft, I would say that was active.
And I will say on the international scale, that does apply. So if you're coming in with the aircraft, even if you're there for 17 days, you're still considered active crew. Therefore, you're not having to do the COVID testing requirements for your destination. I would assume that it's seen as such coming back in because you're flying the aircraft back to the US.
I think the other thing that's really important here too, obviously with a lot of this, we're going to get more clarity on the attestation and what exactly qualifies and doesn't qualify. But I think what CDC is really looking for here first is intent, right? That everybody needs to have a plan for this, and they're giving us a 2-week rollout, and that having a manifest and having an attestation to match every passenger is really what we're after. And if an individual passenger had this type of NA or this brand of NAAT test versus this brand, that's really shades of gray that I don't know if they're ever going to get down into. And really, it's about trying our best first to meet the requirements as we wait to hear for whatever clarity they're going to be able to provide us.
Thanks. Getting into some scenarios here, if the passenger has previously tested positive but has recovered and they have antibodies, but then they still test positive on the PCR test, is there any guidance that would allow that passenger to fly and arrive in the U.S. with supporting medical documentation?
I don't know where we'd apply for that waiver yet. I mean, I totally get the question, and there's nothing just like the vaccine right now is not allowed for a substitute for a negative test. There's just not a good amount of substitutes provided for in this original order about substitutes for negative tests. Does that make sense? They just haven't given us a lot of details there.
Thanks. If the passenger on a Part 91 flight does test positive, is there a process for getting them back to the U.S.?
I think the guidance says that they need to, the CDC says that they should not travel, and unless we're in the scenario before where we were talking about an air ambulance scenario. A positive test means that you should not travel internationally. And so in essence, you'd be waiting until you recover, produce a negative test, unless we see a large population of scenarios like this where the CDC is going to make a broad change or open themselves up to a waiver process that then they have to manage. So I don't know. I think they're going to collect a lot of this feedback and then see what if any, other allowances they're going to give us, because I don't know that they've thought of these scenarios.
And it looks like too, we have some assistance for Lewis on the chat. So some questions we're getting some answers to. So if you are not active on chat, or if you just dropped a question into chat and you haven't seen it come up yet on our list of live questions being answered, do be sure you're checking the chat area. There are some answers being populated there for you. And what I can do this time around is include our chat transcript when we send out the information with our recording, because a lot of good information is coming through there. So Lewis, if you need a breath or even just want to take another look through chat just to see what else we might be missing, I can step in for a quick second, and there are a few quick questions that were pre-submitted that I'd like to get to. Does that work?
Yeah, go ahead, because some of these questions are similar, so I'm trying to figure out what we've already answered and what we still need to address.
And
okay.
And let me go back and make a correction, and I appreciate our guys working in the background here. So addressed specifically in the FAQ, what if I've recently recovered from COVID-19? CDC does not recommend getting tested again in 3 months after a positive viral test. If you have a positive viral test in the past 3 months and you have met your criteria to end your isolation, so that's not symptomatic, those kind of things, then you can travel instead with documentation of your positive viral test result and a letter from your healthcare provider or public health official that states you are cleared for travel. Again, this is that you would then maintain your attestation and not something that you're going to be submitting to the CDC on a traveler by traveler basis, unless you're on the airlines, and then you have to present it to the airline to board.
Adam,
Thanks,
I have one, Annabelle. I mean, I think you already covered this, but if a passenger or the flight's coming from a country with limited testing, are we aware at this point of any waivers?
There's a question about limited testing. I'll have to go back and review that. As far as waivers, no, I have not seen I haven't seen specific waivers for that yet.
And is,
I'll go back to
is
review.
there any option at all that get a test on arrival?
This is a pre-boarding requirement.
What about a day trip from Florida to the Caribbean? Can you do a PCR test in the U.S. and utilize that to arrive back in the U.S.?
That's the point that we're going to have to clarify with CDC, though that seems the logical way to go. We're still going to have to see what their view is on this. I would only imagine that this is the natural way to go, just because you're not on the ground long enough.
Yeah, I think that really, well, let's step back to what it says on paper. And it says, you know, a viral test within 3 days, right? I mean, so it doesn't qualify 1 to 3 days before your departure. So 1 to 3 days before your departure, wherever that departure is, and however it falls into an itinerary, and maybe that itinerary is going back and forth between the same 2 places 10 times in 2 days. But as long as you can provide an attestation that you have had a test within 1 to 3 days, that's the baseline requirement. And if you're, like I said, if we go further down the rabbit hole into these scenarios and ask, you know, for a blessing from CDC on a specific round robin scenario like that, I just don't think they're going to go to that level with us. Maybe we're going to ask the questions, but I don't know that they're going to get down to that level with us.
And one more point I did want to add to that, as far as what testing needs to be done, it's a viral test. So I was wanting to correct myself. And a viral test, as given in the guidance, is a nucleic acid amplification test approved or authorized by the national authority for the detection of COVID. So that's how it's defined in the actual guidance that they issued.
All right, so Louis, I'm going to let you gather your thoughts for a second. I was just going to give Adam and Christine a breath. And quick questions for Philip and Jason here. So Jason, on your side, does the UK have testing kits available currently at our Universal Aviation Office, or accessible?
Yes, we do. So we've been providing PCR testing for clients that need it for onward travel. We have several sources. So here at Stansted, we have a private doctor who can come to the FBO and test both passengers and crew. He can also, with prior notice, meet passengers or crew in their hotels downtown. We also have access to a couple of private medical clinics in London who can provide these tests. And also in the main terminal, over on the commercial side of the airfield, they have a large private testing center there where you can get all 3 variations of the COVID test. One of the big things, though, to consider is getting the test itself is pretty easy, but the laboratories are under huge pressure to turn around these tests. So we've seen variations getting the results back from 18 up to 36 hours, depending on how busy the laboratories are. We've even actually had to courier tests to another part of the country just because we knew it'd be quicker to send those tests. That we'd get a quicker turnaround by sending them out to a further away laboratory, because obviously people want to get these tests back in time for their planned departure. So it is available, but just bear in mind processing time as well, especially if you do need the PCR test, which is the one that is more laboratory intensive.
Well, thank you for that update based on that question. And then Philip, on your side, I had a question specific back to the visa area. For passengers living in the New Jersey, New York area, are they able to obtain Chinese visas? And then in the same vein, you can answer, we had a question in general about Chinese and Indian visas.
Okay, so specifically for the New York jurisdiction, yes. We can secure China crew visas for residents living in those areas. I will say, item to note, as of January 5th, China now has an e-application, which is an online form versus their paper application. So we're talking about a new process. So definitely you can reach out to your G3 visas representative or whoever your travel document procurement team is to get some additional information on that. As it relates to India, now India has not opened up US operations as of yet. They have, some of you may have known, they have transitioned over to a new third-party submitting site. service for VK, I was about to combine it, VFS from CKGS. So VFS is still in the process of setting up their US operations. And once that happens, I do see that we'll be rolling out the India process very soon. Real quick for India, if you do have current valid visas, you can still travel. They have the suspension on those have been listed, unless you have an e-visa or a medical visa, in which case you need to go through the standard process of reaching out to the Embassies and Consulates to secure a standard visa.
Got it. Thank you, Philip, for that. Louis, anything else we want to add on your side? I know we have more coming in. I do have some pre-submitted questions, but we are at 12:54 Central, so I just wanted to check and see what else we can squeeze in here in the next few minutes.
Hey, Annabelle, I wanted to come back real quick and just talk about a potential waiver for airlines and where we're going to go with that question, or waiver for airlines or operators who can't get testing in a foreign locale. So I'm going to go and work towards identifying a CDC list of those countries, because I think that waiver first mandates that the CDC has made a determination that that X country does not have COVID, appropriate COVID testing. So I'm going to go see if there's a standardized list for that, or a live list for that as well, and we can maybe include that in our FAQs, or an application on where you would even submit these waivers if you wanted to request one or had an itinerary with a challenging departure point.
Got it. Oh, thanks for that. That one's, I know, definitely on people's minds. And I know we mentioned it somewhere, I believe, at the beginning, but just as an FYI, not only would this recording be in tomorrow's COVID Ops Update email that goes out to all of you, but in addition, clearly the content itself within the email, we are going to be hitting as many of the key high points and or referring to other key information within that, as usual, making it a resource for you. So some of these questions will also be addressed in that, or at least point you to the information. So it's in both, as many places as we can get it. Louis, was there anything else on your end right now?
This is an interesting question. Back to how it's going to be actually enforced. Do we know anything about if the pilot in command could possibly be held accountable for a passenger not having a valid PCR test if audited?
It doesn't call out the PIC in that. So it calls out the traveler, the airline, or the operator is who it calls out as the responsible parties. I can go back and look, but the PIC being responsible for things like this kind of falls back to a CBP type regulations or a CBP position, and not the way that CDC is treating this particular one from our first review. But I'll double check there. But I think airline, operator, traveler are your three identified responsible parties to make sure that this happens.
How would you recommend verifying the entry documents before taking off?
So I've been thinking, what's the best practice here? Where do we start collecting this? It's one thing to say, if it was part of CBP, we'd be looking at it 48 hours out, those type of things. But I don't know if captains want to be looking at this stuff on the ramp and signing it off, printing out a batch of these and signing it off on the ramp. If this is something that operations would collect and put in their packet, I mean, it's challenging, and I think that's a good discussion over the next 10 days as an industry, is where does this fit in our BizAv process, right? Not only what's required and what do I have to do, but how do we fit this into some sort of streamlined process of collection of other documents that we're already collecting from our travelers.
Thanks, Adam. We've got a lot of questions about home test kits and if that would be accepted, or does it have to be from a laboratory?
It doesn't specifically call out that. The definition itself is basically, it talks about it having to come from a lab, the results of it, or healthcare personnel who perform the test. So that needs to be on the result. I know that the home tests are, the specimen is taken, it's submitted to a lab, and then they provide those results, but there's no clear guidance either way on this.
Can I add a little bit to that? So Christine is absolutely right. In most cases, I know the partner that G3 works with, we do ask the destination for where the traveler is, which country they're going to, so we can determine if they do require a physician's approval of the test before submission. And in which case, if it does, we'll provide Zoom details to that client, and one of the laboratory physicians can actually monitor you while you take the test and confirm and sign off on the test process. So depending on which resource you use to get that at-home test, you'll see that they provide options for you to be able to supplement that additional requirement.
Thanks, Philip. One more question for Jason, actually. Any recommendations for testing at airports outside of the London area, Manchester?
Yeah, I was actually just reading that question and figuring out with my limited IT skills how to reply directly to Deborah, but I couldn't, so I'm glad you asked. You will find most FBOs that you will contact outside of London have made similar arrangements. There's also a lot of private clinics that you would be able to coordinate via the FBO to make sure you've got those tests done. And I should also add a couple of things just on the testing to enter the UK, that it does not apply to crew or passengers under the age of 11 years old.
Thanks, Jason.
And also to add to that, because I did see similar questions pop up for other locations, if we are assisting or managing the trip from Universal side and you are going to XYZ location, then that's something we can seek out at your request. If you need assistance in making those arrangements, we can speak to either Universal office or whichever vendor we're using in order to get that those arrangements made or find those resources for you.
And I want to jump in again. We've reached our 1 hour mark, which is a record for us when it comes to, but you do have so many questions. And I have close to 350 of you still online with me. Definitely respect your time. But my webinar team, if you are able to hang on a few more minutes, we could answer a few more questions. We can just keep an eye on how many folks are still with us. We could answer a few more just depending on your schedule. So this is up to my subject matter experts. If you have the option, we can try to stuff in just a few more in the next 5 minutes.
Let's do it. One of the questions that was coming across in the chat, and I just answered it, and I've seen this question a couple different times, is the records. So maintaining the records, and I think CDC has something on their fact sheet. I haven't seen that link, but there's a fact sheet that says you don't have to maintain your records. And that may be for the traveler, that the traveler does not have to keep a copy of their attestation. But if you look at the FAQ, it says, if I were the traveler, I would certainly want a copy of it myself, but especially if there's criminal penalties potentially down the road. But the FAQ says, what should airlines or operators of private flights or general aviation aircraft do with passenger attestations? Operators of private flights and general aviation aircraft must maintain passenger attestations for 2 years per the order. So I don't know where that fact sheet, but I'll search for that and I'll push it back to the CDC as well so that they can clarify if they've got data on 2 different documents that says.
And also there's a lot of questions about active crew. Active crew by definition, and the way we've been discussing it internally at least, is the persons that are actually flying the aircraft. So if you did a crew swap in some third country and are looking from there to travel to the US in a commercial flight, you are then deemed as passenger. And Adam, I don't know if you have a different opinion on that, but the moment that you're no longer on the flight as active crew, you're now meeting those passenger requirements.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that, unless there was a specific scenario that it tied them back to the aircraft. But yeah, I agree.
One thing, guys, that came up very early on in our process, and I think we even mentioned it, maybe the possibility of this when we were at our last session in December, was this immunity passport idea. And now it's receiving attention as in, like, again, back to that vaccine idea. So at this moment, just based on everything that we've heard, there is no card or either way from that's just specifically going to give you a passport type of access. There's nothing, because there's been question of, will a yellow card, as in like for other vaccines, nothing like that exists currently. It's going to have to develop and see where we go, correct? People are using the term, yes, I have getting notes. People are using the terms interchangeably, yes, okay. So just as a aside, there is no magical immunity passport at just one thing, and one thing I think that's important for our all of our charter operators. So Christine, just to circle back on this, it varies from operation to operation, but we did have questions about face mask requirements, sanitation of aircraft. Could you touch on that briefly?
So face mask, of course, on the international scale, when you are in public at airports, at terminals, they do require that you have those face masks. I know the question pertained more to on the aircraft. That depends on the company's protocols and what guidance they've issued for their crew and passengers on board an aircraft. As it pertains to sanitization, of course, each charter company out there and Part 91 operator has their own guidance on how they sanitize the aircraft. So if there are questions on that level, they can seek guidance from there. As far as operationally speaking, some countries do require sanitization, a certificate. So depending on those locales, we will inform you if you're traveling there. And some other ones require that you deploy the can upon descent and show them that empty can to authorities.
Got it. Thank you, Christine. Okay, so we are at our 1:05, and I know we've stretched quite a bit at the moment. There are more questions that are out there, but in the interest of everyone's time, I think we need to come to a close for the moment. So what I could do here for a few minutes, I think this would be great since our SMEs have been so busy answering questions. I'm going to leave our link open here for the meeting, even though I'll say goodbye to you all as from a live meeting standpoint. And thank you to all of our SMEs, and thank you to our tremendous audience today. But I'm going to leave the link open so that our chat remains open for a few minutes. And if there are any of our SMEs that can take a moment, look back through, see if there's anything we can answer immediately, or at least maybe connect directly with some of the members that are on the chat still. If they're still live, we'll do that for another 3 or 5 minutes. All right, so like I said, I'm going to say goodbye to you now from a live standpoint, but leave the chat open for the next few minutes. So again, thanks so much. We do plan to see you again for our next webinar in about 2 weeks at the end of January. So look for that invitation. And again, this recording and other supporting information will be available to you in our COVID Ops Update weekly email that goes out tomorrow. All right, so from all of us here at Universal, thank you for joining. See you next time. Bye-bye.